All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research. Today we're delighted to hear from Dr. Joseph Joffe, who's the Distinguished Fellow at Stanford University. A Distinguished Fellow, I might say, not the Distinguished Fellow. I'm sure there's many Distinguished Fellows at Stanford University. For his talk titled Nukes versus Tanks, the Challenge of Putin and the Future of European Security. I'm not going to attempt to preview too much of the content of the talk. I'm just going to say, based on the announcement for his presentation, I think his talk is going to be an excellent complement to Dr. Stephanie Bapp's talk we had on Monday that also was about sort of Russia, Ukraine, and the political security dynamics inside of Europe. But I will say a little bit about the speaker, since he is a man who knows of what he speaks on this topic. He has a long and distinguished resume, and what you saw in the announcement for this talk was only a portion of everything that he has done. He's the former editor-in-chief of the German weekly Die Zeit and has returned to academia. He's taught international politics, American foreign policy, and political thought at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, D.C., and their center in Bologna, Italy, as well as at Stanford and Harvard. He's a distinguished fellow at Stanford and a senior fellow at SAIS. In 2005, he co-founded the political journal The American Interest with Zbigniew Brzezinski. Elliot Cohen and Francis Fukuyama. He's also co-founder of its successor, American Purpose. For the bibliophiles out there, I'd also note that he's the author of a number of books, and I'd highlight in particular 2014's The Myth of America's Decline, Politics, Economics, and a Half Century of False Prophecies, and 2006's Uber Power, The Imperial Temptation of America, which are both excellent books. The ground rules, for those of you familiar with CGSR talks, the speaker is going to deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor up for discussion. Please raise your hand electronically. Please submit your questions in the chat function, and we'll get the discussion rolling as quickly as possible once his remarks conclude and try to get as many of you in the conversation as possible. But since we're here in the conference room, and since this is a particularly important speaker, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Charles Ball here, who's in the room, who extended the invitation and would like to say a few introductory words. So Charles, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Just want to welcome Professor Joffe back to Lawrence Livermore after a hiatus of many years. Just to add a little bit to what Mike said, Joe Joffe occupies, I believe, a unique space in the national security firmament. I think his uniqueness derives from two factors. One is that he is distinguished himself in two fields that usually do not cross, and that is as a public intellectual through his journalism and through his academic writings. Importantly, that is supplemented by something that is, again, unique, which is that he possesses native cultural, intellectual, and linguistic fluency on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that's a perspective that, like I said, is unique. And
so does Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, sadly, of course, he is no longer with us. So and I know he was a good friend of yours. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Professor Joffe.
Okay. Thank you. When is the praise coming? So, first of all, I want to start with the wish after having watched Oppenheimer, and how many Oscars did he get? 8, 9? I think it's time for a sequel about this place. Because, you know, this place went a hell of a lot farther in the research and design of nuclear weapons than, of course, Los Alamos did. So I hope for 2.0 Oppenheimer. This talk is going to have two parts. One is what is happening to Europe and what is damaging its age-old security, and then I want to talk about something that is probably more closer to your heart, about Putin's endless threats about using tactical nukes. And I'll try to tie it together at the end. So what's happening to Europe? 2 years ago, war came back to Europe with Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine. And this will go down in history because it ended 77 years of great power peace in Europe. Absolutely unprecedented. in the past. Ever since the rise of the nation state around 1500, you know, the English, Spanish, and French, Europe's middle name was "War is Us," and each peace was just but a pause between two massacres. Now, after World War II, the worst ever of these wars, came to an end. No, it wasn't harmony and understanding that would blossom, but after VE Day, it was only cold and not hot war, and that's why we get these 77 years, you know, a lifetime, unprecedented in European history. It was an endless stream, of course, of crisis and confrontation. Some of you might remember Berlin, which was the place to be if you wanted to be in the crisis business. When in 1961, when the wall went up, Soviet and American tanks were facing each other across the Brandenburg Gate, the dividing line, you know, maybe 1,000 feet apart. And I watched it because I was a kid, and of course I went there on this Sunday morning to watch it, and I found it quite entertaining, I must say, as kids do at a certain age. But it was reassuring because World War III did not erupt at that point, as one might have seen in previous crisis, you know, and that usually was a prelude to the real thing. So to quote Churchill, it was jaw and not war. Now why this rock solid stability after after 45? And I have only one word as an explanation: deterrence, which rested on two pillars. One was massive conventional strength. If you go back to the Cold War lines, NATO had 1 million troops on the western side, plus tacticals and so on. An enormous concentration of power, which I think kept the Soviets sober, as it did. And the second pillar is nuclear weapons. That spelled out a simple rule: whosoever shoots first dies next. Those are the two pillars. And that wondrous world I just described here in a few words was shattered in 22 when Putin unleashed his armies. And the interesting thing about this in my book is this is not just a local threat, you know, to Ukraine. I think it's it's safe to conclude if Putin succeeds, he will want more. You know, start with the Baltics, Moldavia, and Belarus, all of which were once part of the Soviet Empire. And I think that the risk of failed deterrence, you know, Ukraine was failure of deterrence in Europe. The risk keep rising along with the stakes. Because, to repeat the basic thought, Putin's ambitions threaten not just Ukraine, but all of Europe. And indeed the global balance. That's big time. Yeah, so a lot more than a small country there. It's a big time. Because ever since the US became a European power, the US has been twofold. This one: who holds Europe the biggest strategic prize? Which it still is. I mean, think about it. Let me just give you a couple of numbers. Europe has a population far larger than the United States. And it has the world's second largest GDP. No, number two is not China. It is Europe. at least in nominal terms. China, by the way, okay, so is number 3. So the basic question here is, have we fully grasped what we are facing on either side of the Atlantic, there and here? I mean, evidently, deterrence has become brittle. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had that lunge. And why? Well, let's look at both sides. I want to start with the United States here. And to assure my friend here, I will stay away from the Trump versus Biden race. You told me not to do that. So I'll talk, as Henry Kissinger always said, I will talk conceptually, okay? You know, who died last year at the age of 100. So let's look at this side here. I'm pretty sure that American isolationism is rising. But I want to remind you, this reflex that we are seeing now, and I'll elaborate in a moment, is not new. Think about the first wave of the 19th century. And let me quote, and that isolationism was brilliantly dissected by Alexis de Tocqueville, who in my book is still the best observer on the United States. So here, give me a couple of choice quotes. The United States is a nation without neighbors. Separated from the rest of the world, it has no enemies. And he added, the Union is almost as insulated as if all of its frontiers were girt by the ocean. And so he concludes, its foreign policy is, it's more about abstaining than about acting, end quote. Which was, I want to repeat, I want to stress this, which was a perfectly rational policy, as long as the Royal Navy patrolled the Atlantic. And so, whereas these nations across the pond were always fighting each other for a little advantage here and there, the United States was blessed. It had a whole continent to conquer at home. And I must say, with easily vanquished enemies, Spaniards, Native Americans. So it was, in that respect, if you wish, not for the victims, but quite a blissful world, which made isolationism look good and proper. So much for the first wave. Now, but Tocqueville lives on in our days. So then we get the second isolationist wave, which rose, as you will remember, in the early 20th century, when the US stayed out twice, World War I and World War II, only to be dragged in later. But it was a clear isolationist moment, and which the United States was forced to abandon at the end of World War I and in the middle of World War II. But the interesting thing is with its negligence, the U.S. paid with 2 world wars. Those are very serious wars. The U.S. only lost more people in the Civil War, but that was because there were Americans on both sides, so to speak. But I want you to remember Charles Lindbergh and his isolationist slogan, America First, a slogan that was then in our days appropriated by the MAGA movement. But I think FDR made the right point afterwards. He outlined the right lesson, quote, "We have learned that we cannot live alone, that our own well-being is dependent on that of others far away. We must not live like ostriches, unquote. And the third wave is now. And it's fed by both the right and the left, by the way. Not like isolationists were mainly right in the pre-war period. So here you have the GOP, which seems to abandon the internationalism of Eisenhower, Reagan, and the Bushes. And the dream is, again, about a kind of fortress America which we can defend on our own, offshore balancing and all, those terms. Now to the left. Since Obama, isolationism has been creeping into the Democratic Party as well. That never mind a kind of abandoning the Truman and the Kennedy tradition. I want to remind you that it was Obama who pulled troops from Europe, and it was Obama, just like Trump, was bad-mouthing allies, for being free riders, left and right, the same response. And I think that what's new here is that both left and right are tilting toward what I call a kind of domestic isolationism. Let me explain what I mean. We call Obama's mantra, "It's time for a little nation building at home," which he repeated over and over again. And if you look at both sides, they're both into protectionism and welfarism. Doesn't make any difference whether you're conservative or liberal. So you get something like Biden's Rebuild Better, which means showering big business with huge subsidies and the hoi polloi with billions in cash. So, and to me, an important datum was that Nikki Haley, one of the last courageous internationalists, has come and gone. That's an interesting little marker for the time being. So much for the US, the linchpin of the global order. But Europe is also turning inward. Both left and right, by the way. It has disarmed for 30 years. Its million soldiers, on paper there's 1 million soldiers. Damn it. Its 1 million soldiers are not equipped to fight. It's a strength on paper, if you wish. And my best example is Germany, okay? Which used to have an army of 500,000 down to 180. It used to have 3,000 tanks down to 360. That's real disarmament, right? I mean, big time. And same goes pari passu for the others. Now, what the point here is what I would call welfarism. They're not eager to trade butter for guns, even though the strategic situation has changed profoundly, save for the frontline states, the Baltics, the Scandinavians, and the Poles. Trump would love them because they're gone to 2% and more in defense spending. But so where you stand depends on where you sit. And so these nations are clearly at the front line. Now, you take the two major powers in Europe. There's Emmanuel Macron, who talks big, but actually has given less to Ukraine than tiny Norway. Some of you may have read in the press in the recent weeks that he was mulling sending Western troops to Ukraine. That is bullshit. Never, never, least of all the French. Germany, in terms of money, is vastly better. but very tight-fisted on arms for Ukraine deemed offensive. So the idea is we don't want to rile the bear, and we must deny Kiev life-saving hardware, like the medium-range Taurus missile. I know it showed up in the media recently. It's a conventional missile. It's packs 250 kilograms and has a range of 500. But you see, it might hit Russian soil if fired from a forward position. So, no go. So what we have, and of course, the Taurus missile is, if you want to fight a war, it's very important because you want to be able to hit the other guy's supply lines way in the rear. So Ukraine is kind of fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Now, the good side again, both Europe and the US have been exemplary in handing over cash. But now look more closely at this side. US funds, as you've all read, risk being held hostage in Congress, where the GOP wants to exact a deal. We give you the money, but you have to build, you have to have the kind of immigration law that we want. Now that's part of the democratic game, that you do that. You play, trade-offs. But you wonder about strategic logic when the US remains the guardian of the international global order. Okay? Now, let's shift to the European battlefield. And forgive me, I have to bore you with some numbers to make my point. I'll try to speak slowly and distinctly. Now, Russian military spending has increased by 68% this year. 68%. Compare that to its defense budget will reach 6.5. Compare that to the US with 3.1 and an average of 1.5 in the EU. When I talk about 3.1, I'm talking, so it's nominal. Forgive me, a couple more numbers, because it's important data for the battlefield. Russian production of artillery munitions will rise to 4.5 units this year. American and European output is also surging, but not fast enough. So the US wants to reach 1.2 million 155 millimeter, standard artillery munition by next year. So 1/3 of what the Russians are churning out. Europe will only reach also 1.25. Why am I dwelling on such turgid statistics? Because in the Ukraine war, which I want to repeat, which will determine the future of Europe, it is back to the future, so to speak. In spite of drones and digital warfare, but in what really matters in war, mass and drive, it's like Europe is not living up to the grievous nature of the threat. Now, let me now shift from tanks to nuclear weapons, which I know I assume you're much more interested in at this place here. Why drag in nukes if I just harped on materiel and manpower? Because, as you have followed the scene over there, because nuclear weapons are the brooding elephant in the European room. Putin keeps rattling tactical nukes, and he seems to be winning the Psy war. You must have read this in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, whatever. And hence you get a rising chorus demanding a ceasefire and negotiations. Though, I mean, you don't have to be Clausewitz to know that a ceasefire would favor Putin. It would certify his conquest and allow him to ramp up for the next offensive. So the Pope, did you read about the Pope? I guess he's too far away from here. The Pope, man, who runs a kind of 1 billion empire of the faithful, has advised the Ukrainians to wave the white flag. So at any rate, Europe is reluctant to deliver long-range hardware, and Putin's cyber is just doing fine. Why? Now we have a bunch of amateur strategists, mainly in the pundit business, who pontificate that such threats are credible because low-yield nukes won't unleash all-out nuclear war. So it follows Putin could safely launch them because they can't cross the ocean and trigger strategic retaliation. My argument is this: don't equate intimidation with intent. Intimidation is working, but I will argue against the intent to actually make true on the threat. Now we get a little bit of the nitty-gritty. Sure, dially yield nukes range from less than 1 to 170 KT. That's how they're defined. And they are not as murderous as megatons are. But consider an inconvenient fact. Do you know what how much the Hiroshima bomb packed? How many kilotons? Class?
20.
And do I get any other offer?
14.
He got it, 15 KT. 15 KT. And it killed 90,000 people. Today, tacticals may go up to 300 KT. So, look, I'm a bit reluctant to pontificate you because here at Livermore, you know so much more about nuclear weapons than I do. But James Mattis, my colleague at Stanford, and former SecDev, does know a few things about nukes. So let me quote him. I don't think there's any such thing as tactical nuclear weapons. Savor this. There's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Any one is a strategic game changer, unquote. And in late 22, he was echoed by Joe Biden. Quote, "You can't use tactical weapons and not end up with Armageddon," unquote. Let me go back to way before all of you were born, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and quote JFK. Quote, "It isn't the first step that concerns me, but both sides escalating to the 4th and 5th. And we don't go to the 6th because there won't be anybody around to take that step." That was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think these guys knew something about nuclear weapons. So, in short, as Putin waves his club, he cannot count on a fire break. Those who studied nuclear strategy from way back might remember Kissinger's book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. That was a breviary, an instruction how to fight tactical nuclear war. There will be a fire break. I think he let that go in later years. So Putin can't count on a fire break. And, I think his general staff must have read up on American war games. One of my favorite is a Princeton study which simulated a US-Russian nuclear exchange. It began with tacticals, yes, and ended in all-out nuclear war, strategic war, with 90 million casualties. 90 million. I mean, dead and wounded. So the point is of this game, it kind of confirms what these people, what I've quoted, said, you can't count on a fire break. Now let's look at it from Putin's side, okay? Who's been waving all this stuff, and especially his henchmen have. I mean, he couldn't just strike out of the blue, right? Are there any tactical weapons specialists in this room? Great, I can just go on pontificating. But he couldn't just strike out of the blue. Consider the technicalities. The US would quickly, with national means, detect Russia hauling tactical nuclear ammunitions out of the bunkers and to load them onto a delivery vehicle. Short-range missiles, artillery. Space-based surveillance would notice these units going on a war footing, and the chatter between them and Moscow would increase above normal level. So without, but the point I'm trying to make is, without unloosening a single shot, just staying in the threat mode, okay? Russia would have stepped onto the escalation ladder, but not having pulled the trigger anywhere. Now, escalation, in my book, wouldn't stop this side of the fire break, because Putin would have to take out strategic nuclear insurance policy. Mobile long-range strategic rockets and missile submarines would start moving. And as tensions mount, the US could not distinguish between Psy-war and the real thing. So you'd get the reaction on this side. The US would put its strategic forces on DEFCON 2, and then to one gruesomely codenamed cocked pistol, unquote. So would Britain and France, by the way. Small nuclear arsenals, but they would have to go on high alert too. So simple strategic logic says, if you want to start out small, you have to prepare for the big one to deter escalation and annihilation. So on this side, bombers would take to the air, ballistic submarines to the deep, land-based missiles would shed their protective tops. The Russians would see it. and fingers would move toward the triggers. So just a slight miscalculation, a slight misunderstanding could set off an exchange. If Putin starts if he starts a limited war, he has to factor in a strategic exchange whose costs would way dwarf whatever gains he hopes to score against Ukraine. I think these are the realistic description of the dynamics of that kind of situation. Now, let me put this in another way. In a non-nuclear system, states could believe they could win. Hence we get World War I. They all marched off and thought they'd be back at Christmas in 1914. Think about World War II, which Hitler unleashed, and it did quite well in the beginning, as you know. But not so in an overkill world. So in spite of blackmail, restraint must rule as it has done in the Cold War. I told you at the beginning, this ultra-stable system. And Putin knows this. He's not crazy, come on. So take the first step and you face, as JFK put it, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's going to be catastrophic escalation to the fifth. So if JFK and I are right, why is Putin waving his nukes? And now I'm going to go to one of my favorite theories, the madman theory. Have you heard of the madman theory? Also known as the rationality of irrationality. And the greatest strategist of our time, and my teacher at Harvard, I must add, proudly, Nobel laureate Tom Schelling, has a wonderful, compelling analogy to make the point here I've been making in more analytic ways. So picture you're sitting on your porch, sipping your beer. Suddenly a guy shows up on your porch and calmly says, "Give me $50 right here and now, or I'll blow my brains out right here now." Now, probably you would not cave, but offer him, a cup of soothing hot chocolate, and they sit down, let's talk this over. Now the same guy disappears. He comes back in a little while. His eyes are rolling, foaming at the mouth, trembling. Now, wouldn't you rather give him the $50 than have him blow his brains out, and you have to clean up and repaint the porch and spend hours in police questioning? So you'd hand over the $50 and no war, no violence. That's the madman theory, or the rationality of irrationality. But Putin is not crazy. He's not crazy. To quote Polonius in Hamlet, if this be madness, there's method in it. Make-believe lunacy promises to be a winner, just it was for the man on the porch when he started foaming at the mouth. So simulating madness is the real game, whereas even limited strikes are not credible in an overkill age. So let me stress that simple point again. By going back to an exchange in late 2022, when CIA Chief Bill Burns told his Russian counterpart, Sergei Narishkin, what would be in store for Russia if they actually did launch even a single device if Putin made good on his threats. And this is what Burns recalls, quote, Naryshkin swore that he understood and that Putin did not intend to use a nuclear weapon, unquote. Which is heartening, very heartening, and because it confirms my point, right? But it doesn't yet crack the real issue. To come back to the beginning, the future of Europe and the benign global order the US has built and maintained, for a lifetime. Now, as we watch the battlefield, the Russians are clearly on a roll, and the Ukrainians are on a kind of retreat. So Putin's intimidation game is working because funds may be drying up along with the flow of long-distance hardware. So contemplate the worst. Ukraine is down and Russia is up with its divisions on the Polish border and its appetite whetted, as my appetite would have whetted if I'd been as successful as he seems to be. And so the oldest law of international politics says opportunity makes for a thief. Now, I'm not making this up, because if you look at his speech, Putin's speeches over and over again, he has clearly signaled that he wants to restore the old Soviet empire. At least to get a certified sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. I mean, the old glacis of the empire. So let me go back in history a bit more to argue that history reveals the limits of propitiation. Again, ancient history for you guys. We call Yalta in 1945, an important date in the history of the state system, when FDR and Churchill signed over Eastern Europe to Stalin. Now, like Hitler in Munich, Stalin was not satiated, reaching for all of Europe until, this is after the war, until Harry S. Truman raised the deterrent wall named NATO. Yet today, that wall seems to be shaking, even though Finland and Sweden, eternal neutrals, have, so to speak, inserted new bricks. But Biden may not be quite, can I say, use Biden? Biden isn't quite Truman, and Trump, if he wins, seems ready, as I hope that he is not actually, to tear down that wall or dismantle it. And Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz is actually soothing Putin and his party's left. Now, but this is domestic politics, okay? A lot of it is domestic politics. Strategic logic and history cry out that Putin must not win. So as I'm reaching for my conclusion, so set aside his threadbare nuclear threats and shift to the usable stuff, i.e. tanks, missiles, jets, and tons of ammo. Plus a massive rearmament effort in the West. I told you how we all disarmed. The post-Cold War peace dividend has been used up. Yet steel and troops are not enough. The key, I think, is a mental thing. The key is the recognition that Europe's future will be decided in Ukraine. Putin lives by a very simple truth. He understands that. While the West is doing what it does best, debating and not deciding, while just recently Joe Biden has proposed a defense budget that is actually sinking in real terms in our world. And I don't see too many of the European powers that are going up to the magic 2%. So in conclusion, what's the upside for us here today? Look, we are free to debate, right? We don't have to decide, thank God. So I look forward to your questions and your gainsaying me. But I mentioned Kissinger at the beginning. Honor the Kissinger injunction. What's the Kissinger injunction? He once asked me to give a short dinner speech at his house. And I asked, what would you like me to say, Henry? And he responded, anything you want. He grinned impishly, provided you don't criticize me too much, unquote. So don't maul me too much. Thank you for having me here, and let's start. Thank you.